Uh, Thank you everyone for joining us today. Welcome. My name is Karen Bearford. I am the Sea Grant Water Resources Lead, and I'll be hosting this webinar with Stephanie Otts, the Director of the National Sea Grant Law Center. Thank you so much for joining us, and this is going to be our latest installment of the Sea Grant Water Resources Network webinar series. Today we're going to be hearing about the awardees of the recent Sea Grant competitions related to water resources. I'm going to ask everybody to please take a second to be sure that you've muted yourself on your computer and in Zoom. And want to let you know that we're going to have a few activities during the webinar that are going to be in Poll Everywhere. You can participate on those via online or via text messaging, and the links will be added to the chat when those questions are queued in the slides. If you have any questions along the way, please go ahead and enter those into the chat function of Zoom. We will have a short opportunity for clarifying questions after each presenter. And after all three presenters, Steph Otts, again, the Director of the National Sea Grant Law Center, will facilitate a panel discussion where we can dig deeper into the projects and also address broader questions from our audience. First of all, I want to give you a little bit of background about the Sea Grant Water Resources Network. We're actually a group of professionals from Sea Grant programs working to address water-related challenges. We address the four main themes from the Sea Grant Water Resources Vision: environment and human health, water infrastructure, land management, restoration and development, and then water planning and socioeconomics. This group is open to anyone in the Sea Grant Network, and if you'd like to join us, please just send me an email and we'll get you added to the list. We actually started this webinar series last year, and then we have three main objectives for this series. The first is to raise awareness and visibility of Sea Grant water resources programming within the wider Sea Grant network. We wish to highlight the innovative Sea Grant research, extension, education, and communication activities that are related to water resources across the network, and also provide opportunities for networking and strategic thinking around pressing water issues. With that in mind, I want to jump into our three presentations today. Our first is Sylvain. Sylvain is a professor in the Department of Pathology and Veterinary Science at the University of Connecticut. His research interests focus on the influences of man-made and natural toxicants on the health of aquatic organisms, including marine mammals, fish, lobsters, and oysters, with a focus on the immune systems. He also serves as the director for the Sea Grant, or for the Connecticut Sea Grant program. He completed his degree in veterinary medicine and a residency in veterinary pathology at the University of Montreal, as well as a PhD in immunotoxicology at the University of Quebec in Montreal. Then he joined Connecticut after a 3-year postdoc fellowship at the University of California, Davis. Please help me in welcoming Sylvain. And Sylvain, I'll go ahead and let you share your slides.
Thank you, Karen, for your introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sylvain Reguiz. I'm Director for Connecticut Sea Grant, and I'll talk to you today about contaminants of emerging concern, referred to as CECs. CECs include thousands of chemicals that are essentially rarely monitored, not well known, and by definition are emerging. Their toxicity is not well recognized, but we often find them in the environment and we're trying to figure whether they're bad or not. They might also be future candidates for regulation. I'm going to go over today the award that we got, and I will go a little bit fast and not read every word, but give you a flavor of our process for engagement, and we'll see how it goes. So there's a number of classes of CECs. There's definitions for those. Sometimes they're not good definitions. There's a number of different chemicals within all those classes, and then there's more or less known but effects or potential effects that have been found on different levels of biota. They come from different sources, including agricultural and urban, Septics can be a source as plants, although they don't generate CECs, they end up affecting a number of aquatic species, either at the individual, at the population level, or at the ecosystem level. There's no one agency dealing with CECs. However, oh, my internet is unstable, I apologize. However, there's a number of different entities that deal with CECs. For example, EPA is good on policies to protect public health and the environment. USGS is good at monitoring natural resources. NIH is focused on human health and relevant models. NOAA is well known for its Muscle Watch program. And there's a number of state agencies with different form and functions that often relate to CECs with regards to public health and environmental protection. So what's the role for Sea Grant in that mosaic of agencies involved with CECs? That's what we're trying to define. The background of the project more specifically, Congress drafts the budget, and in the appropriations language, there's always directives for how Sea Grant should spend its funding. This year, it said that Sea Grant should spend money on CECs. The national office, I think, had a good idea if we're going to spend money on CECs to suggest a scoping exercise for that includes a project with two goals: a scoping exercise to define a national framework for Sea Grant to engage or invest in CECs, and then test drive that framework through a regional research competition. It had to be regional by the NOFO, and we decided to focus on the East Coast for this stage. We appointed an advisory committee to oversee the progress of the entire project. It started with a thorough literature search, and we're refining the edges right now. We completed a national survey. We got 647 responses. If you're one of them, thank you very much. We held 5 regional workshops, and now we're taking all that input and turning that into a national framework that will support a regional research competition. From the survey, there were respondents from different regions, most from the Southeast and the Northeast, from different sectors, most from academia, strong response from Sea Grant staff, but also from federal, state, municipal agencies, NGOs, and interested citizens, and some, although not very robust, from the private sector and from students. Most of the questions follow the Likert scale, ranging from not at all important to extremely important. And we asked a number of questions, but importantly for each of those questions, there was an opportunity to provide comments. And those comments were very, very helpful in the interpretation of those results. With a distribution across categories, we tried to make sense of things. So we average for each question, we averaged the responses. And we also related that to our Likert scale words. So 4 was very important. So anything above 4 is at least very important or more important than that. And then we looked at whether there were differences by region. The regions are represented by different colors compared to the light blue in the first column that is the national average. We also looked at differences by sector. And you'll notice that the dark brown, that's students. Remember, they were not very abundant, but students tended to think that everything was more important than the average. And the private sector often tended to think that things were less important than the average. Overall, 85% of respondents thought that CECs were very or extremely important to the mission of Sea Grant. And that, I think, somewhat validates the purpose of the scoping exercise. A way we looked, a couple of examples on how we looked at different differences among regions, monitoring, and we learned later it's likely associated with a number of ongoing activities, but monitoring was viewed as more important in the Great Lakes than other regions. Drinking water is also important for the Great Lakes, which is not surprising. They're a significant source of drinking water for at least the region. And on the other end, in the Gulf of Mexico, there was less emphasis on septics. Maybe there's fewer septics there. So that's just a couple of examples. So following the national survey, we convened 5 regional workshops that in total engaged 124 participants from diverse sectors. And we emphasize a diverse representation from federal, state, local agencies, the NGO sector, academia, the private sector. Introduce the project and what's happening in your idea landscape. And then we brought up the initial highlights of the survey as initial elements of the scoping exercise or areas for investments for Sea Grant. And that's what I'm going to present to you in the next few slides. So rather than reporting individual results from the survey, we worked at integrating across the questions and having a number of topics or general areas of emphasis. For example, we heard loud and clear that Sea Grant is well known for integrating research, extension, and education. And if we do work on CECs, that should continue. That's the identity of Sea Grant. We heard that different classes of chemicals may be important in different regions for different reasons. Even if we had originally envisioned that we would narrow the scope for Sea Grant to study, the feedback that we got said, no, don't do that. Of course, Sea Grant should continue to engage partners, and we had a robust discussion on monitoring and concluded that it's a long-term commitment, and Sea Grant may not be the best fit to be the entity responsible for that investment. However, Sea Grant research may inform monitoring. Sea Grant extension may enhance the reach of monitoring. The scope and scale, there was a lot of support for One Health, environmental health approach that included humans, but as part of the ecosystem, not separate. There was recognition that Sea Grant works in different areas, including ecosystems that looks at the aquatic food chain, commerce, for example, fishing and aquaculture, and a lot of comments on food security and food safety. And it was recognition that all of those are important and they're linked. There was support for a watershed approach for Sea Grant to take, there were discussions on the importance of drinking water, wastewater, and effluents as all relevant point source and non-point source for CECs for humans and the environment. It was recognized that prevention and policy aligns with a lot of what Sea Grant does, including the legal functions within Sea Grant, and it helps bring the natural and social sciences. Research priorities were identified for Sea Grant investment, including broader ecosystological impact or approaches. A lot of emphasis on health, human health. Species are important as part of that ecosystem approach. There was reasonable emphasis on fish, both on as part of the food chain, but as part of recreational and commercial fish species that are important for human consumption. Again, emphasis on watershed approaches that would include a transition from rivers to estuaries to coastal systems, including how things change and how that might affect CECs and their bioavailability. There was support for more complex studies, for example, looking at mixtures, cumulative effects, chronic lifetime exposure, even although it was recognized that those may be a little too expensive for Sea Grant to work with. And there was discussion on harmful algal blooms, and it was concluded that they're important for what Sea Grant does, whether or not they are true CECs. On extension, there was broad recognition of the importance of responding to community needs. There was a lot of discussions that looked at ecosystem, the interface between ecosystem health and human health, and that often revolved around risk benefit of seafood consumption. There was emphasis on the importance of linking with other agencies, whether they're regulatory or non-regulatory. Education priorities were very closely aligned. There's a lot of work to better define CECs, where they come from, what they do, risk and benefit of seafood consumption again. And there was recognition that education plans could benefit from a health of a watershed approach. A lot of discussions on partnerships, but what came out most interesting, I guess, is the combination of the capacity that exists in federal agencies in terms of resources and knowledge, and the most immediate needs at the state level, and the idea that Sea Grant might play a role to link those. And a lot of discussions on environmental justice with the recognition that some rural communities or urban communities are often disadvantaged or underserved, are often at the receiving end of most of the exposure and effects of contaminants, including those emerging and the older ones, the legacy contaminants. And there was recognition for meaningful outreach and engagement that addresses, for example, language barriers, education information gaps. A lot on fish consumption, often related to subsistence fishing, subsistence harvesting of seafood, and the idea that monitoring programs should include environmental justice concerns. And with that, the next steps include completing a national framework. Initially, we were asked to do that within 6 months. It's now, we were extended by a month. It's the end of April. And then in the spring, we expect to release a regional research initiative RFP. And with that, I'm going to pause and see if there are questions.
Just verify, Steph, do we have any clarifying questions for Sylvain?
Nope, not at this time, but people are free to add them into the chat box, but I think we're good to move on to the next speaker.
Okay, well then we'll go ahead and we'll move on to Karen. Karen's going to talk to us about the mitigating runoff project. Karen is a research associate at Stevens Institute of Technology and previously worked as a researcher and project manager at the Urban Water Management Department at RISE Research Institutes of Sweden, one of the major multidisciplinary research institutes in Europe. She has a doctorate in decision support for sustainable water management, focusing on providing guidance on cost-effective sustainability and eco-economic profitability of alternative water management options. With that, Karen, do you want to go ahead and share your slides and let us hear about your project?
Sure, thank you so much, Karen. I hope you see the presentation. And we are, I guess, the newest project on this presentation. So hold on, let me see so I can move the slides. Here we go. So I will actually start by presenting the team who's working in this project. PI is Pete Rowe on NJC grant, and we've got 3 co-PIs, Deep Sarkar, Sedjen Kui, and Yang Den from Stevens and NJIT and Montclair State University. And then me from Stevens, Colette Santisari from NJIT, Jamie Ewald Gray from Delaware Department of Environmental Resources and Environmental Control, and Lisita Yang from Montclair State University. Let me see. So our project started quite recently, this January, and will continue through 2024. The primary objective of the project is to optimize the deployment of innovative green infrastructure and low impact development techniques to mitigate runoff and pollution impacts on freshwater systems, and to eventually protect coastal ecosystems in the US. And to achieve this primary objective, the project has some key specific aims: to identify key knowledge gaps, and to identify and prioritize research needs and roles of the Sea Grant network, administer the regional competitive research grant program, and to develop a strategic document to serve as a roadmap for the Sea Grant network. And the project consists of 2 components. as Sylvain already talked about for his project. It's the first scoping study where we use a combination of different approaches, work with literature review, interviews, surveys, and stakeholder advisory group workshops, for example, and all this to identify and prioritize research areas and sea grant roles and activities. And this will then end up in the strategic document, which is a living document that will be updated throughout this project. And so far, as we quite recently started, we have focused mostly on the key challenges, the knowledge gaps, the research needs. And I will go through today a little bit of our results that we had from our stakeholder survey and a little bit from what we got from our just recently completed workshop. And the second part of this project is the Regional Competitive Research Program, which will fund up to 3 research projects within the Mid-Atlantic Sea Grant region. And these projects will address some of the knowledge gaps and research needs identified in the scoping study. And the outcomes of these projects will also be used to update the strategic document. So I will start with just sharing a little bit information on what we got from this online survey. It's actually still ongoing, but we have about 200 respondents so far, mostly from municipal governments, research organizations, and consulting. We asked them what type of GI lead experience they have. Most people have experience with some sort of implementation issues, followed by education outreach, communication, and policy and planning. We also asked them what experience they have, from which type of GI lead technique they have experience. And many of the respondents had experience from many different types of techniques. Most people, though, answered rain gardens, followed by bioretention cells and bioswales. And in one of the questions, we asked them to rank the importance of some GI lead benefits on a Likert scale. 0 meant no opinion, 1 meant no importance, and 5 very important. And as you can see on the top row here, water quality improvement was the benefit that most people considered very important. And this was followed by row number 2 here, the protection of water bodies, improved habitats, and row 3 with the runoff and flood risk reduction. And we also asked them that if the GI lids are applied to improve water quality, what are the pollutants of concern? And here the sediments and nutrients came out on top, followed by heavy metals. And within each of these categories, we asked them to specify what pollutants they had in mind. And I tried to visualize that their responses in a word cloud here. You see nitrogen, phosphorus, sediments in silt and sand, for example, but you also see a lot of microplastics, pathogens, grease, oil, pesticides, different types of runoff, road runoff from construction and from agriculture areas, for example. Another question, we asked them if they could mention some obstacles or barriers that they had encountered when working with GI lids. Most people mentioned financial barriers, problem with getting funding or financing for long-term maintenance, and was problem both for installation or implementation and for research, actually. But a lot of people also mentioned social and technical barriers, and I will show a visualization of the social barriers that they mention here. A lot of people mentioned that there is a resistance to change. These are new methods. There is a lack of understanding, both in the residential community and sometimes within the workforce. There's a lack of understanding of understanding the benefits, cost savings. There's also concerns about gentrification, aesthetics due to poor maintenance, not in my backyard. And also a lot of people mentioned that some people actually do prefer old school gray infrastructure. And this is the last slide that I will share for the survey because of the time limitation, and I will now move on to a little bit information that came out from the workshop we had last Friday. It was with a stakeholder advisory group. There are a few, maybe 10 more people, but that couldn't make this first workshop. And in this workshop, the focus was to get even more input on key challenges, knowledge gaps, research needs, and potential rules of the Sea Grant network. And I will show some information. We haven't had time to analyze the information or results there thoroughly yet, but I will share some information or input that came out from research needs or research areas. There was a lot of discussion about costs and benefits, about quantifying or monetizing them and over time, for everything from public health, property values, heat island, green jobs, recreation, pollution, load reduction, flood risk reduction, etc. And also about generalizing life cycle costs across climate regions or states. And there was some discussion about whose benefits and costs are we talking about? How are these costs and benefits distributed in society? And for climate change, there was a lot of discussion on how do we design these techniques or these GI lids for extreme weather to be able to perform both during drought or dry periods and during downpour. And how do we balance flood reduction with pollution retention? A lot of comments were also on incentives and which are the incentives that work. And how do we address challenges, the known challenges already during the planning phases or planning phase? And ask for user-friendly decision support tools. And for GI lid techniques, a lot of discussion or input came that it's needed, more research is needed on evaluation of performance of new technologies or new media or retrofits, and comparative performance assessments for various geographic regions, climate conditions, plant soil combinations, etc. And maybe not a research area, but it was a lot of discussion about technology demonstration, that it's needed, showcases, and maintenance. Maintenance came up a lot, both in the survey and in the workshop. How do we design to minimize long-term maintenance, and what are best practices for maintenance, for example? And within social science, a lot of input came on public perception and awareness, social preferences, how to best get community engagement, and how to best incorporate environmental and social justice. And that was it. And I put my email here and actually a link to the survey as well. The survey is still ongoing, and I assume you will get these slides afterwards, and please go in and complete the survey. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. And when we start the next presentation, I'll put that link to the survey in the chat as well for you. So All right, well, great. Do we have any clarifying questions for Karen at this point?
Yeah, we don't have a question. I think Sam Chan had a question in the chat, but there's been some discussion that I think may have answered it for him. But yeah, I think that's it.
Okay, great. Thanks, Steph. Then we'll go ahead and we'll move on to our third presenter. Tiffany Sprague is here to talk to us about the Water Equity Project. Tiffany is a stormwater resilience extension educator with Minnesota Sea Grant and holds a split appointment with the Natural Resources Research Institute, which is part of the University of Minnesota Duluth, as a stormwater research coordinator, as well as being the Institute's DEI coordinator. Originally, Tiffany is from the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and she spent the last decade studying small urban watersheds along Lake Superior's North Shore and helping communities to identify opportunities for collaborative watershed management. With that, Tiffany, we'd like to hand it over to you and tell us about your project, please.
Thanks, Karen. Just confirming that you can see my slides.
We can, thanks.
Thank you. Awesome. Thank you. Today we're going to talk about our water equity project, also known as One Block at a Time, which also has a very long title, which you'll see we're very good at producing throughout most of this project. I just want to give a little framing though, before we get into the meat of the project, to kind of build a reference to the value of this project and why this work is important. So let's first start discussing, Great Lake communities are experiencing more frequent storms and flooding events, which I know we see nationwide, and I know that this isn't new knowledge for most of the folks in this room. And then we also know that our marginalized communities of low income, those communities of color, and those communities that lack access to safe and stable homes and neighborhoods typically are the most impacted by these climate challenges, such as flooding, degraded water quality, extreme storm events. Yet they also have the fewest means to adapt and mitigate these challenges. And we also know that through previous research and community-based projects, that if we can really build strong community government collaborations, that we can work on improving this resilience. And that can help to do other things such as overall improvements to community health, that can work on saving lives, that can work on protecting infrastructure. And that's exactly what our project is set out to do, with a collaboration between 3 Sea Grants across the Great Lakes. So I here represent Minnesota Sea Grant, and we're located in Duluth along Lake Superior's North Shore. The 2 other Sea Grant programs involved in this project are Illinois, Indiana Sea Grant, as well as Pennsylvania Sea Grant. Both of these all 3 of these communities or Sea Grants have projects in communities localized to their kind of region, as well as the fact that all of us are collaborating across the Great Lakes. And I'll talk a little bit about how we're working together as Sea Grants, as well as working within our community. And really the goal of this project is to have mirrored processes within each of these communities that are still tailored and specific to our individual neighborhoods or folks that we are working with, but that can be scalable and reproducible across our communities. So with that, we are looking at engaging with frontline communities, those that are most challenged by climate challenges, particularly flooding and rain events. And then we're looking at how can we build our opportunities for these communities through multi-beneficial green infrastructure. So how do we do more than just flood control? What other resources can we give to the communities when we think about moving through an implementation project? Through that, we're trying to also do other things like professional development opportunities for undergraduate students or through programs like AmeriCorps. And then as well, we have this end goal of developing a toolkit that can be utilized by other communities. And I'll talk a little bit more about that toolkit here in a moment. Through that, we're going through 3 primary phases of a project. And again, those are all being mirrored in each of our communities. And I'm going to say community a lot, so I just apologize in advance. And those 3 main phases are this background assessment phase. And that's the phase that most of us are in right now. And that's really us looking at what kind of hazards and challenges do these communities face. And you'll see that each of the 3 Sea Grants are kind of in a different degree of how much knowledge and awareness they have of that and what kind of resources they have around that. And you'll see that as I talk about each of the Sea Grant programs. And then through that, moving into a community visioning phase, and that's us working in community and with our community members. And then finally moving to an implementation phase. I really want to highlight this community-driven listening and vision sessions, because that is a different kind of tool than maybe some of our traditional outreach or extension work. You know, really the listening session, you're moving beyond that informing and consulting of community leaders, and you're really moving into a process of recognizing shared leadership between the community and the local government. So really what you're working on is focusing on building strong, trusted partnerships. You're making sure that you're involving community members through all phases of the project, and that you're really putting emphasis on maintaining relationships beyond the initial project. So really this process puts an emphasis on looking for opportunities that create that co-benefit. So we're looking at how can we help, again, our frontline communities with green infrastructure-based projects that do other things, such as contribute to community health, that can help with food security, that can offer green space or recreation opportunities. And you'll notice that the title of our project is One Block at a Time. And so thinking about how we scale this project, looking at working at the scale of a single city block. The reason that we are looking and working on this single city block scale is that it allows for projects to be highly visible and noticeable, both by community members and municipal leaders. It also means that the scale of the project can be scaled to what the city block needs, depending on what kind of composition that block has. Is that businesses? Is it residents? Is it mixed use? Is it renters? Is it homeowners? As well as what challenges is faced by that city block, as well as what challenges community members wish to address. And then as well, it's a scale that we find can be very reproducible in other communities, right? I think we've all seen reports and studies, or we've seen really inspirational projects where great communities are doing work at the scale of greening entire beltways, or they develop green infrastructure plans for an entire community. But if you aren't able to bring in that type of funding, or you don't have the resources for that funding, maybe you don't already have long-term established relationships with the communities that are most in need, maybe just in general, you're a small municipality, that project scale can feel very overwhelming and can be very challenging to be successful in. So hence why we're really focusing on this one city block scale, because we hope that then that helps that build that strong foundation, gives that feeling of success, which can then help build future projects in collaboration. And so when we talk about this toolkit that we're looking to develop across the Sea Grants that are involved in this project, really that's looking at how do we build these background assessments? We know that there's a lot of reports and there's a ton of data out there. And even though the data and reports may be specific to these Sea Grant communities, it doesn't mean that there isn't some commonalities among them. Are we looking towards codes and ordinances? Are we looking towards scientific reports on flooding? You know, so our goal is to identify what are these primary resources that we looked to help build this identification of hazards within these communities, as well as trying to develop, you know, process agendas, survey materials, focus group conversations. And again, they're still going to be tailored to communities and the needs of those communities, but what's kind of the common framework from which we worked from? So each of the Sea Grants are collaborating to identify what are some of these commonalities and what are some of these things that can be reproduced in other communities. For example, in Minnesota, we're learning right now as we're developing a community survey, there's a lot of resources among our community partners, our other nonprofit organizations, our other frontline working groups that have already developed surveys and trying to identify what are those commonalities among those, and why are we all developing them in individual silos and thus also reproducing them, resulting in community fatigue of answering similar surveys over and over again. How can we develop a standard, make that standard unique and customizable to the neighborhood needs? As well as one of the end products of this project will be community summaries that highlight the individual process that would happen in each community. I'm going to walk through the three main projects that are happening that are individual to each kind of Sea Grant program: Pennsylvania, Illinois, Indiana, and Minnesota. And I should note that each of our projects are at different scales based on essentially where we're at in this time with our community engagement. So I'm going to start with Pennsylvania Sea Grant and the work that they're doing, as they're still at this high level. They have a knowledge of the hazards, but they're still working to identify what communities are most impacted. How are they impacted? Who are those frontline communities? What opportunities do we have to engage with them? Through Illinois Indiana Sea Grant, where they have long-term established relationships with community groups. They've already been in community, they're working, they're already at the implementation project stage. And then Minnesota Sea Grant, we kind of sit in the middle of that, where we have a strong leadership team with individuals and organizations that work within our frontline community, but we're looking to integrate ourselves within that community through this project and actually do that first implementation project. I should note, I'm not obviously a Pennsylvania Sea Grant or Illinois Indiana Sea Grant employee. And so I have some knowledge of these projects, but I don't have very specific details. I do know that Kara from Illinois Indiana is here today. So if you do have very detailed questions about individual components outside of Minnesota Sea Grant, I will at some point have to defer you to some other colleagues, just as a heads up. Pennsylvania Sea Grant. So Pennsylvania Sea Grant's leadership team is really embedded in this larger CRANE network, which is focused on identifying climate hazards and coordinating responses for their region. And for Pennsylvania, what that really means is understanding, again, which specific communities are most impacted and vulnerable to storms and floods, and what are their opportunities to engage with these communities, to start identifying their barriers and to start identifying what needs they have. So through this project, Pennsylvania is looking to form those initial connections with that climate challenged community and identify where could a potential pilot site location be for installation of a multi-beneficial green infrastructure practice. So to date, Pennsylvania Sea Grant has engaged a number of college students, which has been fantastic, in helping them dig into that background assessment and to identify what are these climate hazards that they have and where are these communities that are most impacted by them, as well as doing some really awesome 3D visualization models. So they're looking to actually build 3D flood hazard models. So they have a visual representation of the hazards to communities. So that way, when they go out into community, they have essentially a tangible representation of what is there and what damage can occur. It's just a fantastic blend between kind of this research-based, this really computer technical work and taking that to communities to have those conversations. In Minnesota, we've been working with a leadership team focused on a frontline community in Duluth. And again, like I said, we're pretty much ready this summer to take that jump and actually do in-community engagement and work with our residents to install a multi-beneficial green infrastructure project. So our local leadership team for Duluth was developed about 4 years ago as part of a larger program called the Great Lakes One Water Partnership. And that partnership was developed as a way to support community foundations across the Great Lakes in addressing climate challenges. And that current project team that we have in Duluth expands beyond, also including AmeriCorps Vistas, both past and present right now, as well as our next step is to develop a team of paid community members that we're looking to as our focus group team. So as I mentioned before, in Minnesota, we have a pretty fair understanding of what our climate challenges are. We have an understanding of the disparities that these communities face. And really, we're looking to develop that team of residents that will work alongside us to identify that specific city block that has needs, as well as what that implementation project is that offers that multi-beneficial use space. And I should note for us, most of our capacity comes from working with AmeriCorps Vistas, who have successfully written grants, received small mini grants, and have already started doing engagement in our community around the values of water and around the challenges folks have recreating in our current green spaces. And right now, our concentrated effort is developing a community-wide survey that's looking at what concerns do our residents have around climate challenges, particularly around flooding, and then what kind of green infrastructure projects are of interest to them? What do they find valuable and why would they find those valuable? And then for Illinois Indiana Sea Grant, as I said, they are superstars and they are already working in their community and they have for a while, and they already have that implementation project identified. So the Indiana project team has an established relationship and network working to address the many needs of the neighborhoods, particularly through community gardening programs, looking at food security and food access. So this means they already had those community groups mobilized. They're already jumping into listening and visioning sessions with those community groups, and they're already collaborating with their neighborhoods to design and install rainwater harvesting systems for these community gardens, as well as already looking at opportunities for long-term training and education, again, to go back to maintaining and sustaining these partnerships with these community groups.
1 minute,
So
Tiffany.
this,
Just one more minute. Yeah.
thanks. Yeah, I'm almost done. So this means that in the end, they've already have their focus groups. They have students as well engaged in this process, which has been amazing to see, helping to design those rainwater harvesting systems, as well as collaborating with scientists to understand potential issues around, using rainwater harvesting systems for watering food, working with food safety officers to develop educational and outreach materials for their community. Like stars that both Pennsylvania and Minnesota are kind of idolizing right now. And then I just want to throw out here, and I can put this link in the chat, is just a link to the Sea Grant website, for the Minnesota Sea Grant website for this project. So I will say that website is a little skewed to the Minnesota project, but it does touch on all 3 of the Sea Grants and the overarching project. That's all I have.
Great, thank you, Tiffany. And so we'll go ahead and come back to the slides. And before or as we're transitioning to the panel, we have another poll everywhere question for you, and just wanting to kind of gauge from people, what about any of these projects really excites you? And give all 3 of our presenters thank you so much for those presentations. And if you guys could come back, and Steph, do you want to take it away for the panel discussion?
Yeah, I can. So I don't know how much time we want to give folks to kind of get into Poll Everywhere before we get started, but Brooke has just dropped the information about Poll Everywhere in the chat again, so you can copy and paste that and get to Poll Everywhere and to share your thoughts about what excites you about these projects. But for our panelists, I thought we might start with this kind of a broader question, just about kind of your experience being involved in these type of national scoping efforts, and what you think of the idea of the network leading these type of exercises, and maybe in their lessons learned. Like, should we do this more often? Is this something that you would think should continue? So I don't know, kind of which panelists want to take that first.
I can get us started. I think that there's a lot of on-the-ground experience within the network, and I think that the reports, the presentations we've just seen demonstrate that there is creativity that is grounded in community needs, and I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think CGRN should do more of that, as opposed to a solicitation that comes from the national office without the benefit of a broad engagement and experience on the ground.
Great, thanks, Sylvain. Anyone else?
Sure, I'll jump in. I mean, our project just started, but I actually see a lot of importance in doing these national scoping studies, and to see both, well, I guess within SGWRN, but within the research community and within the community itself, what's missing, what are we asking for, what's needed, and it seems like all people that we have talked to are very willing to share their experience, and they want to contribute. So I think it's important, and it's interesting, I have to say.
And Tiffany, did you have anything you wanted to share?
I feel like our project is slightly different just in how it operates, which trying to think about how we scale at a national level is both challenging and exciting. I think from the standpoint of thinking about, I think we get so wrapped up and we get used to working within our bubble of responding to our immediate stakeholder needs, but acknowledging that these needs are really transferable across many communities. And so thinking about how can we help other communities have that foundation to successfully engage with those stakeholders. I think that's the part that as a team of the 3 Sea Grants that are working on this are really motivated by and excited by. And it also makes it challenging to think like outside of your immediate stakeholder audience and trying to be reflective of kind of that nationwide need as well. So I'd say it's like a yes and for us.
Great. Thanks. Well, we have a couple of other questions for the panelists that I'm going to get to, but I want to encourage all of our participants to ask questions of the panelists. So you can go ahead if you have a question for the panelist and put that in the chat. But we wanted to circle back, Sylvain, for your presentation. We had a question about what you meant by a regional research initiative. Was that going to be an RFP?
That is correct. So the NOFO from the national office requested proposals to address 2 main goals: a national scoping exercise, and then that is followed by a regional research initiative. Since and I should have added that our team includes North Carolina Sea Grant and New Hampshire Sea Grant, as well as the University of Connecticut. We decided that we would focus broadly the regional research initiative on the Atlantic coast. So sometimes this spring, we will issue a request for proposal on contaminants of emerging concern that aligns with the priorities that we have drafted.
Great, thanks. And this is kind of how, goes into maybe some, because it's really interesting to see the different places that all the projects are at. But if someone wanted to get involved in the project, Sylvain, it seems like you're kind of now to the point where you're going to be issuing the RFP, but we know that there's also the survey on the other projects. So if any of the panelists kind of wanted to talk about ways that if somebody was really excited about an aspect of this project, how they can get involved.
Well, hopefully everybody on this call has been involved in one way or another, responded to the survey we had. We reached quite a few people, 650 people, and we engaged 120 people in a follow-up discussion as part of 5 regional workshops. So there's been considerable opportunities for engagement, and that engagement produced a rich basis for drafting a framework, but there will be an additional opportunity for engagement that will include getting money out of this, or at least the potential for getting money out of this by proposing research projects.
Great. Thanks, Sylvain. Karen?
Yeah, sure. So in our project, it's of course the survey link that it's already in the chat. We would definitely like you to respond there, but there's also an opportunity. We're going to start to do more interviews and look into more into the Sea Grant roles and within GI lids. So if any of you who are listening have relevant information there, you're welcome to reach out to me or to Pete Rowe. For example, just contact us and you will be part of the interviews, or just send relevant information if you want to. We actually also welcome more people if you want to be part of the stakeholder advisory group. So there are many different ways to get involved in the project.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. So thank you so much. So Tiffany, I don't know if you wanted to speak specifically in response to that question that I asked, but there's also a question in the chat for you as well. So
yeah, I see that question. Thank you, Stephanie. Yeah, our project doesn't have that same kind of national scoping at this phase yet. So maybe there's less opportunity in the same way compared to the other 2 projects. but I think about the opportunities to connect with either the 3 Sea Grant programs or the individual Sea Grant programs if you think that there's work that aligns, to think about, again, sharing of resources, which leads to my answering this question by Katie here in the chat box, which is the One Block project going to publish a guidance or reference document for other communities? And yes, that is the toolkit that I kind of mentioned, looking at trying to develop these kind of standardized process agendas, the resources that we looked to in doing that community scoping work, as well as kind of this community engagement process we went through in each of our communities, as well as surveying that we have done and how we went to that implementation phase. So that is the goal, to publish a guidance document for individuals. So we envision at that time is when there can be a lot of engagement among the network in terms of presentations by our group, as well as feedback of a kind of what does and does not work for you in this toolkit, to kind of develop one that is most responsive and most beneficial for as many communities as possible.
Thank you. Thanks, Tiffany. We got a good thank you in the chat as well for that. So, and I think maybe our last kind of setup question for the panelists is, these were kind of big competitions, heavy lifts to bring a lot of partners together. And so maybe if you want to comment on like what previous work or partnerships that you feel brought you to the space to be prepared to respond to this type of RFP and executing the project. And maybe to reverse our panelists, Tiffany, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, sure. And I kind of touched on it a little bit. Each of our programs have a larger network or some previous effort that has kind of led them to feeling competitive in this space around competing for this RFP and feeling like, yes, we could do a successful project. And again, really our goal is, sure, right, there's like the selfish part. You're like, I want to do this great thing in my community. But really the thing that bonded our programs was the fact that we really want to develop something so it doesn't feel so challenging for other communities. Especially it's what we're feeling in Minnesota is it seems like there's these things and they're out there, but how do we make them tangible, and how can we reproduce these efforts without every community having to start from complete scratch, ground zero? And so that's really that end goal that we decided to reach for. But for us, and I'll speak for Duluth a little bit, and maybe I'll throw it to Kara if Kara would like to speak on Illinois, Indiana's standpoint. But, for us in Minnesota, what helped us was we've actively been working with the community leadership team for our community in this particular frontline neighborhood for over 4 years, you know what I mean? And that's been in the background. That is a lot of collaboration, vision planning. I mean, the fact that 4 years in is when we finally feel ready to dive into the community and have that kind of forward-facing conversation just kind of gives us an idea of how long it takes to build that trusted network of partners, that trusted network of partners that help integrate you into those frontline communities, that help build your network out. So just acknowledging that there's a lot of time invested before feeling ready to apply for an RFP like what came out for the one we applied for. And then maybe Kara, I don't know if you want to throw anything, not to put you on the spot, about the work from Indiana, that kind of partnership building.
Sure, no, and very similar. We've been working in the space with green infrastructure and community engagement for quite some time, and in particular, we knew there was a strong need for the rainwater harvesting work and community garden integration that we're focusing on. So we had a lot of those parts and pieces set up, and we just didn't have yet that focus. And when this came up, it was the perfect opportunity to leverage those networks, those lessons learned, and apply them in a more meaningful way. So similar to what Tiffany had shared as well.
Great, thanks. Any of the other panelists have thoughts about that?
So from our project, I don't know if there are any other of my team members still here, but I might not be the best person to answer because I wasn't part of Stevens when this RFP was out. So I give it over if someone else in my team is still on the Pete.
Hi, Karen. Yes, I'm still here. So you still have a crowd. I see a few other names from our team here, so you're okay. It was, the back end. It's the end. It's going to be the cool thing with how we keep people connected. But if many of you don't know, New Jersey Sea Grant Consortium, we have about 20 institutional members, and it just happens to be a lot of good people that work in water quality and water design, and they were very excited about the possibility, and so that just got us rolling. And the topical area for the runoff mitigation and pollution control was a natural for them, and so once we got going, it went along quite well. And so the challenge is to get our initial scoping results so we get our priorities, and I think we will have a good response through the Mid-Atlantic, because we've even had more time now to chat with the Sea Grant programs and other programs in the Mid-Atlantic. We had a lot of support from the Mid-Atlantic Sea Grant programs, from the Water Resources Institutes, from some of the estuary programs, or the National Estuary Research Reserves that put a lot of support in it. So there was a network out there, and so we kind of had that, and they jumped right on board to be overall support. So I think that's one of the reasons why we had some success to get the proposal through.
Great.
I would build on what Pete says with very simple words: knowing people who know people. We wanted to take a regional approach before we took a national approach, but it's knowing people that that have relationships, and that was important when we started the project. That was important when we included the idea of regional workshops. We enrolled people from each of 5 broad regions to help us convene the key players in their regions, and they reached out to their Sea Grant colleagues and colleagues outside of Sea Grant to gather the right people for the right conversation in each of those regions. And it was the same for appointing an advisory committee. We tried to identify what kind of people, and we just happened to talk to a number of people who knew people who would fit those characteristics at the national scale. So knowing people know people, I think Sea Grant is pretty good at that. We don't know everything, but we know people.
Great, thanks. Okay, we've got a question in the chat. So Sam's got, so this goes back to Tiffany. Moving forward for the One Block project, what are the effective ways to engage people who do not want to participate, and what are we learning for effective ways to support the adoption?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure if we're actively pursuing those who do not want to participate. I think one of the things we're really learning is the value of those, which I think we knew the value, but just how critical those frontline organizations are. Particularly for us, I'm only going to be able to speak for Minnesota, so I apologize for that if that doesn't give enough of a perspective. But for Minnesota, it's so important that we have these very strong relationship with those frontline communities, organizations. So I'm thinking these nonprofits that focus around food access or safe and stable housing or transportation, our community foundations, building those strong relationships with them, because they have a strong sense of who in the community is an active leader or is a willing participant. And that can include individuals, that could include other organizations, and that can include the spaces that help us have those conversations. So for example, right now, as we go into our kind of, I don't know, we'll call it our summer season of being out in community and engaging with folks, even just learning where are those spaces that folks frequent and feel comfortable and happily participate in those spaces, and thus are willing to have those conversations. I'm not quite sure, admittedly, what we mean by learning to support adoptees of green infrastructure, adoptees of engaging with frontline communities. So I'm really not sure if I have the best way to answer that second part of the question.
Okay, great. Well, we have one last question for the panelists as we start to wrap up, and please, you can continue to ask our questions in the chat, but we were just on a kind of final thoughts on lessons learned from your project so far. Maybe, you know, whether you think this type of project should be tried again. Of course, we have different models here. Some are scoping followed by research, and then we have more regional focus with the water equity project. But yeah, I would love to hear the panelists' thoughts on that.
Well, I'll get us started again. One thing we did that was extremely beneficial was to have, as part of our team, not only representation from most of the functions in the SGWRN network, but we hired an external facilitator who could deal with the logistics, the engagement, the facilitation, and we could be participants without having to be facilitators as well. And I think that was extremely beneficial. The other thing that worked really well is following up a national survey with some more direct, more in-depth engagement at regional workshops, and doing that in different places. And that allowed us to not only test drive what we learned from the survey, but also to have more in-depth discussion, more polishing, more sometimes arguing, sometimes agreeing, sometimes not agreeing. And I think that was very useful.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah, no, I appreciate your thought about the external facilitator that the National Sea Grant Law Center hired one on one of our projects. And it was made a huge difference to have someone else that can handle that and allow you and your staff to be part of the process. Yeah.
I will kind of copy the answer there. I kind of like all the responses that we got from the survey. Maybe a lesson learned or some, yeah, I might have wanted to include some more questions now that we know a little bit more of the project, but that's always the thing. You need to start somewhere. But it was really good, and we got a lot of good information from the survey. And then again, as Sylvan said, to have good workshop discussions after that was also really, really good. So for us, it's a lot of work now to analyze all the results from the survey and from the workshop, and then move on. But yeah, it was good.
I think one of the things we're really learning is the power and value of the Sea Grant network, which I think we all know, but I think this project for us is really highlighted through either our small group conversations, or as we have conversations like this, or with other community of practices within the Sea Grant network, just how much this conversation around engaging the stakeholder audience in frontline and marginalized communities, and how much interest there is, and how many folks are doing that, and there's so many similarities in how folks are doing that and the ability to share that, but then also recognizing how folks are tailoring to their community needs and what opportunities we have to reproduce some of those. And just, I think there's a lot of power here, and there's a lot of knowledge sitting on the screen. And so we're just really learning how valuable that is in sharing resources and sharing processes. And so it's just been, for us, that's been a fantastic opportunity.
Great. Thanks so much. Well, I want to thank all of our panelists. We still have a few more minutes if there's questions coming in, but I think I'll turn it back over to Karen.
Thank you, Steph. Really appreciate it. And yes, thank you, everyone. Wanted to go ahead and thank our presenters, Sylvain, Karen, and Tiffany. We really appreciate your time and coming to explain your projects to us and talking with us today. Also wanted to thank our support team. It wouldn't be possible without all the people that are behind the scenes Steph has been great in co-leading these with me for the last year, but Catherine and Olivia from the Sea Grant Law Center, as well as Brooke from South Carolina Sea Grant, are just absolute lifesavers in helping us to manage these webinars as we go. So thank you all for your help and support along the way. We wanted to also let you know that we do have several more webinars planned for this year. Tentatively on June 21st, we're actually going to have the National Integrated Drought Information Center system, which is NIDIS and NOAA, come to talk to us about tools, resources, and possible future collaboration. This is actually going to include a conversation about how drought intersects with current and future Sea Grant program interests and possible future ways that NIDIS can support Sea Grant programs across our states. We're also going to be getting some information on what is publicly available via the National Water Model, how to access that, and different potential uses for the information. And last but not least, we are planning on having a HABS webinar later this year. If you have any interest in helping to plan any of these, please let us know, put your name in the chat, send me an email. We have been asked, we have a question here. This is our last poll everywhere. If you have a minute, go ahead and let us know which aspects of HABS you would most like to learn about in a webinar. There's a lot of options here. There's just so much information that's being captured by the network right now. If you don't have access to the poll everywhere, or there's one of these that you're particularly interested in, please feel free to put that in the chat as well. We can't obviously cover everything in a 75 to 90-minute webinar, but we will try to capture the things that are most important to the network. So if you have a second, go ahead and let us know what you might most like to learn about.
And just to remind everyone, Brooke has put the link in the chat box too, so you can either type it in or copy it from the chat.
We have some options coming in, and we'll let this roll for a few more seconds, but it will remain open if you're in there, and feel free to go ahead and finish. Or like I said, if you want to throw some a topic or two in the chat, we'll certainly add that to the ranking too. Well, with that, again, we just added a link to the Water Resources Visioning Plan, and want to, again, thank everyone so much for joining us today, taking your time, our presenters, as well as our support team. Please take a few minutes and complete the webinar evaluation summary. It's going to be, Steph's going to put that here in the chat. We'll also send an email with a reminder this afternoon or tomorrow morning. Please let me know if you'd like to join the Sea Grant Water Resources Network. We can add you to that mailing list for sure. We will be making a recording of this webinar. Well, we made a recording, but we'll make that available via the National Sea Grant Law Center's YouTube channel. Thank you again for joining us. We really appreciate your support and look forward to seeing you again soon.